Welcome to Relative Mentality. My name is Jack,
And I'm Joe.
and we are not here to be therapists, but we are here to be family. And
Yeah.
today we're given the language on PTSD and CPSD versus overall trauma. So take it away.
Yes. And this is one of those moments where I'm really recognizing how hard we really went with this podcast. We definitely started with a hi, how are you? And then grief. And now PTSD. Like we are not messing around here. So, yeah, another lovely, serious, maybe scary topic for us to get into. I know we've already talked about some of our personal pieces with that in the last episode. And so now we are giving the language. We're going to talk more about some of the technical parts of it. Everybody strap in because here we go. So I think where we start has to be like, what is trauma? Is it the small thing? Is it this big thing? Like, what actually is trauma? And I think it's important to remember that it can sort of stem from kind of almost anything that gives you a really strong emotional reaction to it. So there's some that we know and that are kind of obvious, like war or natural disasters or a direct abuse. So we have to realize, though, that that's not the end, right? Those obvious traumatic things that we can all sort of universally look at and say, that's traumatic. We have to remember that there's also smaller traumas or traumas that might not be so overt. As you sort of said before, comparison is the thief of joy. And I think that happens with trauma a lot. Comparison is the thief
I'd say healing
of
to some
healing.
degree.
Yeah. Of healing, of just validating yourself. Right?
Mhm.
So again, trauma can be anything from getting into just a small rear end accident, which someone might not necessarily think that's trauma, or having a unhealthy toxic relationship that doesn't necessarily involve obvious abuse, having a job that's just really hard and stressful and maybe overwhelming. All of those things can also give us trauma. Again, it's obvious when it's life threatening, but there are all of these tiny little things that can happen to people on the day to day that can also feel traumatic for them. Because what feels traumatic for one person is not what feels traumatic for another. And I think our family is a good example of this, is we're all raised within the same family.
Mhm.
But whether we were traumatized or how that trauma has affected us is different amongst all of us. Even with my brothers and I, even with you and your sister, there are just so many different ways we have responded to it. Or between us, right? We talked before about how you get quiet, I get loud. That's our natural reaction to sort of overwhelming things based on how we started reacting to trauma. So then I guess the question is like, what's the difference between trauma and PTSD? And maybe this is weird, but I would honestly like to ask you that question as someone who is not in this field. Like, what do you think of as a difference?
So the sass in me wants to be like, I feel like it's a square rectangle situation because obviously PTSD and CPTSD both include the word trauma or traumatic. And
Right.
so it's like out of those, trauma can be a part of those, but not all trauma are those. And I was thinking, like, as you were talking, I was just talking to someone about a broken nose, which sounds very innocuous, but I'll make sure to get to the point where it's like, if there are certain things that happen, it's like a doctor will refer to trauma to the nose. They don't necessarily, because it doesn't have to be fully broken to have like a deviated septum or whatever. You could have just trauma there. And so you have physical traumas. And, obviously the more extreme versions, losing a limb, becoming paraplegic or something like that, like, yes, there is that aspect of that type of trauma. But then there's also, from what I've learned or what I have gathered from the years of therapy that I've been a part of or I've went to, it's like PTSD is more of a single unit of time where you think of a severe car crash happening or a severe illness or, my buddies in Afghanistan getting blown up, things of that nature. Whereas CPTSD is more of a, this happened over a long period of time where you have the abusive
Mm.
relationships that you don't realize that you're in, or even like with the growing up and the intergenerational trauma. That's something that happens over a longer period of time, especially because of how we grew up, where we grew up in regards to that. It's like, well, that's just how life is. is because it happens over so many times. Whereas I find societally, there's more of an acceptance or even a not pity, but just more of a, oh, I feel so bad for you when you're like, oh, I lost a limb, or oh, I was in a mass shooting or something like that, versus, oh, I was in this abusive relationship. Well, why didn't you get out? Is immediately those responses. And it's like, okay, that was not a cool reaction at all to that. Sorry, I know I like went on a very long tangent. But that's
No,
kind
I
of
love
how
it.
I understand the breakdown between all of them, where it's like trauma is everything to some degree. And then it's like, how does it impact you and how long did it happen is kind of where you then start putting it into different boxes.
Yeah, you brought up the stigma piece, and I think we're going to talk a little bit more about that later on. But
Hmm.
that's exactly it, right? Trauma is, when you said the rectangle square, I was like, yes, exactly. PTSD and CPTSD are trauma, but not all trauma is PTSD or CPTSD. So PTSD is like a one-time traumatic event. It's important to remember, like, being deployed or something that is maybe not like one day,
Hmm.
but is like one part of one experience can
Okay.
be considered PTSD, right? If it's all sort of part of the same experience. So people in like high stress occupations, like the armed forces or emergency services, like, yes, it might be one specific time where, okay, like a bomb went off, or it could be just say in like response to 9/11, where it was over a long period of time that those first responders were going in and doing those things, right? That could still be considered sort of PTSD as opposed to CPTSD, which is usually that really long ongoing trauma sort of repeating itself or continuing to happen, or multiple traumas sort of happening. And a lot of times it does happen in childhood is when that sort of stuff happens, because when we're adults, like, we might be able to walk away, or we have that autonomy that we don't have as kids. And also we have a way to voice as an adult that we don't necessarily have as kids. Not to say that's the only reason why in childhood maybe there's more CPTSD, but that's a big part of it. You are beholden to your caregiver or parent. And so if they continue to do something that is traumatizing, whether that be neglect, abuse, whatever that is, that's the sort of thing over the 5 years of your middle childhood that's going to have a big, long lasting effect, because it changes the way our brain works. People don't often understand that. Our brain starts to work differently because of significant traumas like that. So, say something you might see in someone with neurodivergence, like trouble concentrating or thoughts sort of bouncing around. Well, I mean, we can get into how there's crossover of symptoms and everything. It's just mental health, it's just a big Venn diagram. But your brain can also react that way because it's when you're traumatized, because it's putting all that extra energy into trying to protect you. So it can't focus because all your energy is on how do I protect myself in this moment. It can't hold on to the importance or like object permanence, because if it's not directly in front of me about to hurt me, I don't need to be worried about it. I need to be worried about what I can protect myself from. And that is sort of where we get into also like fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response, which is something that I feel like when we were kids in the last century, I feel like it was just fight or flight. And then at some point we added freeze onto it. And now at some point we have added on fawn. So even sort of conceptualizing how my response fits into one of those categories has changed in my
Oh,
lifetime,
yeah.
at least.
Like I had heard of freeze for a minute and I was like, oh, okay, I freeze. And then I found out about fawn and like did research on that. I was like, oh shit, I fawn. Like I fawn. I'm like, all right. And I kind of want to go back a little bit because when you're talking about childhood traumas and, things of that nature and how it fundamentally kind of changes some of the neural pathways and all of that. I know people in my life, and I would argue that I'm probably one of them, where potentially the reason why I don't remember parts of my childhood and I know other people don't is because our brain was focusing on surviving. And going back to the whole fawning thing, I was like, okay, how can I make the situation safe? So it was like, this other person, what do you need from me? How do I alleviate this situation? How do I even work to make sure that this isn't a problem? And I still have those thought processes to this day. I constantly think of hypotheticals. And to some degree, even in the workplace, where when I was getting trained at one of my jobs, my boss at the time, when I asked her, I was like, okay, well, what if this happened? And she was like, I worked here for 12 years. That's never happened. Guess what, motherfucker? 2 years later, it happened. Because I even said, I was like, okay, well, just in case, what's the closest case scenario and how can we possibly, because that's just how my body feels that it needs to survive, especially when it comes to work, the economy being insane. It's like, okay, so what can I do to make sure that I keep my job? Because, everything feels so unsafe in a way. And so to go back to the childhood thing again, because I keep thinking and going through full thoughts, with the childhood thing, that's how you grow up. And so that's how you expect love to function when you were told societally and even by your friends as parents, even your other family members, it's like parents love you unconditionally. That as an adult and through much therapy, you're like, oh no, this was very much so conditional love. But because that's what you were taught, that your parents love you no matter what, and that's just how it is, it's like, oh, so this is what love means. And so then that turns into you end up potentially going into abusive relationships because you believe that is the love that you deserve. And when you go through therapy and you do all this unpacking, at least from my perspective, I'm like, oh, I don't like how all of this connects to itself, but it makes a lot of sense. And that makes me feel a little bit better to know that, okay, this shit was all tied together. And so in a way, it's not entirely fate, but in a way it is, because it was like, I didn't do that unpacking before this happened. So then that's one of the reasons it could have happened, And that makes me feel as a victim and survivor of certain things, that gives me some comfort.
That makes me think about the fact that we are programmed as kids. If you think of our brain as the most amazing supercomputer in existence, as many people do, we get all of that programming at a very young age. There's some that we are born with, our primal instincts, and then there's a lot that is built in those first 5 years, 10 years. So we have to sort of undo that. And we don't know we need system updates until we're older. And then that's what therapy is. It's like manually going in and doing all these updates on our brain and being like, this doesn't help. This doesn't make any sense. Why is this connected to this? That doesn't make sense. And so we're kind of just going in and undoing a lot of that programming we have when we are kids. So you're totally right. So to just go back to PTSD and CPTSD and really wanting to make sure that we touch on what do these actually stand for? Like it's alphabet soup, right? And we see that so much in mental health, like all of these acronyms thrown around and things like that, which is great and that's fine. But sometimes, yeah, what does it really mean? So PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder, and CPTSD is complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So the difference between them is the complexity of it, and the complexity of it comes with the sort of continuing nature of CPTSD that PTSD does not necessarily have.
Question. And I know this isn't 100% supposed to be, teacher-student situation, but I do kind of feel this way. So does that mean to some degree that PTSD is more of a external in that it's like COVID or 9/11 or something like that, and then CPTSD is more personal and is something that happens specifically to me versus like a car crash is something that just happens versus something more insidious as, not a great childhood with that relationship or a bad relationship with parents. I'm just curious on how that works.
No, that's a really good question. I think at its simplest, yes.
Okay.
At its simplest, yes, that is sort of the difference.
Okay.
But having to keep in mind that being in, say, like an abusive situation, something that's happening to you, if it is sort of brief or one situation, as opposed to a continuing thing that is repeating time and time again in your life, right?
Okay.
So, for instance, luckily both of us are too young for this to happen to us, I think, but back in the day where maybe you got like beat with a paddle at school sort of thing, right? Like the nuns and the paddle and like that classic idea of going to a very strict religious school is. So if that happened to you and then you went home and told your mom and your mom said, well, screw that, I'm not going to let you keep going to a school where they're like getting a paddle out at you, and you go forward from there, you might still have have a PTSD, a traumatic response to that time where it did happen. But because you were sort of removed from that situation, it didn't become something where it became normalized and was happening over and over and over again, sort of thing. That's not an exact
Okay,
science to
so
it.
maybe, hold on. So
Okay.
maybe PTSD is more of a singular event, and then hold on, because let me just hold on just 1 second. Singular event, and then CPTSD is like, even if it's the same type of event, it's reoccurring. And I will do the caveat of like, clearly COVID was over the span of time, but it technically was somewhat of a singular event, still happening, but it's still like, you can look at it as like the flu pandemic and then like the COVID pandemic. And obviously the way that has impacted people is different based on whether or not you had long COVID, or, people fucking died from it. So and then how does that, having someone who passed in your life, but it's still technically just that one event. Would something like COVID be PTSD or CPTSD? Oh no.
I think it would come down to sort of the experience again, right? So
Okay.
if you
Okay.
are someone whose life was affected by the fact that are going to work and self-quarantining and all of that, you might have had, yes, this one experience that is COVID. Now, could it technically turn into CPTSD, especially if there's like multiple deaths that are happening, or like you said, long COVID, and now there's a hospitalization, and there's all of these things on top of it that's taking COVID, which is already hard, and then complicating it into this bigger, more lasting, longer drawn out sort of thing. Again, PTSD can technically happen over an amount of time, but it's sort of being one general experience of not greatness. Whereas CPTSD is, this isn't great, plus this isn't great, plus this is happening, plus this. And so it's like, you're not just getting traumatized once at that time, you're having multiple ways you're being traumatized, right? By the repetition, yes, but also by the multi-layered nature of it. And I should say too, like, this is not a perfect science to say 100% of the time this is PTSD, 100% of the time this is CPTSD, and 100% of this time it's just trauma and you'll be fine. So much has to do with the person and what their individual experience going through it is. So again, two people who are living in the same house, going through the same things, one might walk out feeling very traumatized by what happened, and another one might walk out feeling like, yeah, I'm okay. Or maybe it was just the time there was that one thing in our family for one person, and for the other person, it's like, yeah, but here's how there's been patterns of this stuff affecting me. So you have to keep that in mind, that we're all individuals, even as close as being siblings or related to each other, and being in the same situation, it can affect us totally differently.
So, and a quick synopsis of what you just said, just for my knowledge, ultimately what you're saying is something that is PTSD for one person could be CPTSD, depending on the situation. Like, you have these two people who live in this same house, and there's really only a single event or, a couple. And so it ends up being more PTSD for them versus the other person in the house where all of these other things impacted them as well. And so it's CPTSD for them.
Yeah.
Okay. Yay.
Essentially.
Well, and this is also why I am such a big proponent of just telling everyone in my life, because the world is chaotic to begin with. And on top of it all, even in the microcosms of relationships between family and friendships and romantic relationships, sometimes it's good just to have a third person to talk to, where it's just like, there's between everything, impacting people differently and all that. I'm like, go talk to somebody. Just talk to somebody that has no bias. That's why I'm like, therapy, therapy, do it. Right, right.
Well, and that gets to the point of, again, how does it affect us and what comes out from it? Because there can be like a lot of self-blame too. Like you sort of mentioned earlier, like, why didn't you leave? Or why didn't you react differently? And that's where we get into that fight, flight, or freeze, or fawn. So like that so much can affect how we respond, especially in the moment. So just to break it down, what that means, fight is someone who's going to not necessarily even like physically engage sort of fight, but that is going to challenge, that is going to react outwardly. So that's the person we see who gets emotionally dysregulated by it, who kind of blows up with anger maybe and like starts yelling at people or punching holes. Again, it doesn't have to be that extreme, but that might be what we think of when we're saying fight. Flight exactly what it sounds like. It's like, let's get the hell out of here. That doesn't mean that you have to leave the house. It might just mean like going to your room, hiding out, going into the backyard. I mean, I think we see that a lot with children, especially if there's like stuff going on in the house, they will go and hide to try to feel safe. Freeze, what it sounds like, is that you just are paralyzed. You're unable to take action. And that doesn't mean you're like mannequin challenge, unable to move necessarily. There may be some of that that comes from it where you maybe like can't stand up, can't run, can't get your body to do all of the things that you want it to, but it's almost like sort of shutting down. How do I remove myself? Even if I can't physically remove myself, how do I shrink in to remove myself from it? And then the newest one that we're recognizing is Fawn. And this is the one I feel like I see a lot in our family and people that I'm close to, which is your reaction is to basically be like, how can I fix it? How can I make it better? You're getting angry. So how do I soothe you? The person that's getting angry, the person that's hurting me, the person that is exploding. How do I calm you? My focus becomes, how do I fix you so that then myself can be protected from you, the situation, whatever it is. So it's how do I fix it as opposed to how do I fight it? How do I run from it? How do I shrink from it?
Especially with our family, because that is somewhat, as we've talked about in previous episodes, a lot of the matriarchs of the family. It's all about, let me sacrifice myself to a T so that I can fix this, so I can help this, so I can forget about me. I don't matter. How do I help the family? And to some degree, it's to a detriment. And so, from what you're saying, it's making me feel like it's almost a natural thing to go to that with how everyone in our family acts in regards to like parents to child to child to child, like the intergenerational behaviors, not necessarily traumas, but just the behaviors of I will focus on fixing, where it's like it's more ingrained. There's a problem, you got to fix it. Oh, you're raising your voice. How do I not placate you because that could make you more angry? How do I make you happy? How do I fix the situation? What did I do wrong? And it's like, well, first and foremost, motherfucker, you might not have done anything wrong. So I can see how like that's another thing that can be passed down, especially because again, children learn by seeing behavior. And it's like, well, that's how mom did it. That's how the aunts do it. That's even how some of the uncles do it. That must be what you do. That must be how I should react.
And it can also be really interesting because, you know, that's why I have three brothers, and I can sort of see how they've each responded differently. I would say, like, between the four of us, we probably have all of them. Like, probably the oldest is fight, the youngest boy is flight, the middle one's freeze, and I'm Fawn.
Yep, I can absolutely see that.
Yep. And so it's interesting how all four of us were raised in the same family, same things, and there are a lot of things that we can explain how having the same mom sort of affected us, but maybe it has something to do with birth order that might play into it as well, or the fact that I was raised female, like I'm a cis female, and they're cis men, like that might have something to do with it as well, like how we fell into each of those things. But that again is we all are going through the same, especially them, they're all close in age, they went through very much the same experiences, and their response to the trauma, to the hard stuff, is very different about what they're going to do in the moment and how we're going to choose to protect ourselves, even though we're all trying to protect from essentially the same things. I think it's also important to remember, like, this is physical and mental and emotional. Like, physical is part of it. When we are stressed to that level, when our survival mechanisms are triggered, our bodies release stress hormones, including cortisol and adrenaline. And so it's prepping your body to react to whatever it's scared of, right? To whatever the perceived threat is in that moment. And yeah, the reaction is not just, this is what my brain is saying to do, but it's also what our body is automatically doing without us necessarily even knowing. And how can that even be upsetting? Cortisol, adrenaline, flooding your system, but then maybe you're frozen and that cortisol and adrenaline has no way to work itself out. It has nowhere to go. So then that within itself can kind of be like its own little poison for you, right? It can be its own thing that is just amplifying all of those feelings because we've got all of these chemicals that have nowhere to go because
Oh
of the
yeah.
way we react. And then, of course, there's the mental reactions, fear, helplessness, shock, numbness, normal responses to these things, which are adaptive. And usually in the short term, they're helpful when we go into dangerous situations. So again, going back to that idea of programming or the primal part of us, our brain says, I need to run because there is a lion. And so we run. Well, not anymore, not in modern world. We don't necessarily have that same thing where running is necessarily a reasonable reaction all of the time. So our instinct is run, and that comes from a place of we need to protect ourselves. How do we keep ourselves physically safe? But is that maladaptive in our current world? Yeah, usually often it is.
Talking about running in particular, it reminded me of the fact that it's like when I started dating my now husband, I kept thinking, oh, this seems like pattern recognition to my ex who's very abusive. And it's like, well, abusive people aren't going to be abusive right away or you're going to leave. And so I kept wanting to run because I was like, he's very generous, he's very nice, he's very kind. And I'm like, so was this other person who ended up being horrible. And so I kept wanting to run. And, I would talk to my therapist about like, but like I think he's a good guy, but it seems like it, and so I don't know what to do. And it's like just breathe, just take in these moments, and it doesn't even have to be necessarily like super argumentative thing that you have to leave or even something big. Like it's one of those things in regards to even like jobs where you're like, oh, I'm seeing similar things to like this previous job that I had, and is there any way that I can do this, that, the other, or do I say fuck it and just leave? When there's certain ways and certain emotions that you tie with other things happening, sometimes leaving just feels safer. Where you're just like, I just want to burn this bridge. I don't want to deal with it because I've dealt with this bridge before. This bridge was so unsafe. Burn it and fucking run away. And then, the physical aspect of it all, it's like there was something that very traumatic happened to me, and I did a lot of therapy around it. And I felt this physical thing, just a weight lift off of me. Had no idea it was there. And it was the craziest sensation. I don't know how to explain it to anyone who's never been through it. And it's like I had moved to Georgia with this weight on my shoulders. I had made some pretty big life decisions with almost like this veil and this heaviness. Sorry, I'm getting sidetracked, but there really is so much when it comes to trauma that, especially with where we grew up and with the people we grew up with, it's very much so you're fine. Everyone goes through it. And it's like, shut the fuck up. Even if that's true, even if everyone grows up with it, doesn't mean it's right, doesn't mean that you can't feel those things of the things happening to you and then work through them.
Well, it also sounds a little bit like, okay, I'm not your therapist, I can't diagnose, this is just,
Sure.
what I'm hearing you say, but that starts to sound more like PTSD. Right? That there are
Mhm.
these things that are triggering us. So the difference between, again, just regular trauma and our natural response to that and PTSD is there's more persistent and intense symptoms that significantly impact. So I'm not your therapist. I don't know everything, but what you're describing to me sounds a bit more like PTSD because it's not just a normal stress response in the moment. It's this sort of triggered response because of something that happened in the past. And that's where the difference is. PTSD involves persistent or intense symptoms that impact your daily life, that are stopping you from doing things, including maybe moving forward in a relationship. So if we think of trauma as a normal stress response, PTSD and CPTSD are exaggerated responses. And that's not to say exaggerated like to minimize it and say it's not valid, but it just means it's not necessarily proportional to what's actually happening in the moment.
Hold on a second. And I don't mean this in a
No,
derogatory
it's okay.
term, but like, are you saying that CPTSD and PTSD is you just exaggerating, like having
No,
over dramatic responses?
no, 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 no. See, that's what I'm
Okay.
trying to, sorry, that's what I'm trying to
Okay.
clarify. That's what I'm trying to clarify. It's not
Okay.
exaggerated in like you're doing too much. It's
Okay.
exaggerated in like it just feels bigger than maybe it is. So imagine you saw a mouse, but then
Okay.
there's a spotlight right behind the mouse. The shadow of the mouse is huge and looks like it could be this really scary animal or creature that you need to be afraid of, but in reality, it's just the mouse. So when it's a healthy trauma response, we see the mouse and we go, eek, just like that. You make that exact noise, eek, and you get scared and you have a response. Okay. That response makes sense. It is proportional to the thing that we're seeing. When we're talking about PTSD and CPTSD, we are not seeing the mouse. We are seeing the shadow. We are seeing this big creature that looks super huge and super scary. So our reaction is still proportional to what we're perceiving, but our perception of whatever the thing that's happening is skewed and altered by our past traumatic experiences. Does that make more sense?
So you're saying our responses to current things are out of proportion in relation to what our previous thing has. So like in your example, our previous PTSD or CPTSD was actually a bear. So when we're seeing this mouse now with this shadow, we're thinking it's a bear, but it's actually just a mouse. Okay, so it's not the initial that you're talking about, it's the going forward, because it's
Right.
like,
It's our
okay,
reactions as we go forward. Whatever your response in the moment is valid. I mean, all of your responses are valid, but whatever your response in the moment is, we can look at it and say, yes, that's
okay.
valid. And we could definitely say, okay, that makes sense. But then it's when we're looking at how we continue to be triggered with it that we start to go, okay, is this valid? Sure. Is this reasonable? Is this actually just a response to this thing that we're seeing in front of us? Or is it the trauma that is reacting? The trauma and the past that is reacting to this?
So it sounds like, aside from the fact that obviously each person is different in how they react, how they feel and experience everything, it's also like there's a lot of different factors that would have to define what the PTSD or CPTSD is versus the event or events itself. How you respond after the fact to similar things or same exact things, getting hit by a person and then getting hit by a different person later on, like that type of different things. So it's not just it's this because it was this single event, or it's this because it was this over this. It's how does it also impact you later on?
And it's also has to do with time a little bit too, right? So
Yeah.
if we're thinking something traumatic happens to us and for the next month or two, even up to like 3 months, it's a little bit bothersome. Okay, you are still processing that trauma. Well, when we start to get beyond that, when we start to get to 6 months, a year, 2 years, and that thing is still bothering you, not just in the moments where you're like processing it with your therapist and you're being activated, but is coming into other parts of your life and bothering you, that's when we're looking at something more like PTSD or CPTSD, because the effects are lasting much longer than whatever happens. Thinking of it from like the point that whatever traumatic thing stops, how long does it take you to recover after that would decide if it's just a sort of trauma response or if it's into the PTSD, CPTSD, where this is a more long-standing aggravation, a more long-standing dysregulation, an effect that it's having on you.
I think I got it. I mean, it's also hard because, I am just a person,
Yeah.
whereas you've like gone to school and like learned shit about this. It's like
Right, which is why I want to make sure that like what's coming off is not like, oh, this is my high level Freudian understanding of mental health, but like I want people to be able to understand the way I do, even if that takes like a different sort of description.
Well, and I'll be completely transparent as well. It's like something that I learned about myself is it's like if you're teaching me something, you tell me a sentence, and then I will tell you that same sentence, but in a slightly different order. To me, that is a completely different sentence. You'll think I've asked you the same exact thing, and I'm like, no, in my head, that means something completely else. But it's different than my understanding of what I thought all of those things were. So it's very interesting to get this perspective and knowledge on it. Because, yeah, this is not at all how I understood it to be.
Well, because I don't think people know, because it's about nuance. Mental health so much comes down to being about nuance to differentiate between this and that and the other. So it does take a lot to sort of understand all of those little nuances. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I understand every single part of it, because again, each person is going to have their own journey and experience, which is going to affect them in different ways. If it affected everybody in the same way, it'd be much easier to treat. But it's going to affect people in different ways and in all different parts of your life too. Like we were saying physical, we're saying mental, but it can be your sleep being disrupted, not being able to eat, or maybe staying away from certain foods or not making healthy food choices. An exaggerated startle response where you're on the street and a car backfires and you throw yourself on the ground because in your mind that automatically means you're in danger because of an experience you've had in the past. And I think what's important to remember is that this is involuntary, and that is so important. It's not just something you can say, I'm not going to do this anymore. It is 100% involuntary. It is recurring, and it's often like distressing memories, flashbacks, thoughts, feelings, reminders that you're trying to avoid, all of these things, but it's never something you choose to do. So when people sometimes get hard on themselves, like I should be better or I should have done better, but you can't help it. These are involuntary. We cannot help our automatic thoughts and feelings. We can choose what we do with them after they show up. But with PTSD, CPTSD, that is a lot harder to do, especially if you've not been in therapy or done something where you've learned how to respond in those moments instead of the natural response for you, which has become dysregulation.
I kind of want to say something, and please correct me if I am
Yeah.
totally in the wrong. Not to discredit literally everything we've been talking about, but I think it's also very healthy as well to just acknowledge when you're experiencing things and not looking so directly for a label of like, is it PTSD? Is it CPTSD? And it's like, to some degree, who gives a fuck? It's like, these are what's happening to you. And that's why in my head, it's also very important to like talk to your support group or others, like if you feel safe enough to do so, or therapy if you need that other person. Because I know that to some degree, when given a label, it can almost put you in a box where it's like, okay, well, it's CPTSD, so I need to do X, Y, and Z. And it's like, no, look at the feelings, look at your reactions. A thing that I've seen lately with a lot of parents that are our age with like toddlers, where it's like, your feeling is valid, but maybe the reaction isn't. Like, for example, when a toddler gets upset and angry and then they want to start hitting shit. And it's like, hold on, well, what are you feeling? How are you mentally reacting? And it's like, focus on that. Am I wrong in saying that?
No, I think you're totally right. I often compare, I don't know if you've ever seen Men in Black and there's like the little alien that's inside driving the big tall guy. But that's us. I think there's just little babies that live in our brains that sort of that are kind of controlling our adult selves. And so, yeah, we can often look to how a toddler might respond and how we might respond to a toddler and how we can respond to ourselves as well. And so, yes, it's that idea of the automatic response, that feeling, that is valid. But what we can change and what we should be looking at is what comes next. But that can be hard as well, especially for people who have been, this is long-standing PTSD or, CPTSD, where we're gonna see things that make it hard for people to get help, like persistent feelings of emptiness and hopelessness. If I'm hopeless, then I'm not gonna think anybody can help me. Difficulty of managing your emotions, especially when it comes to like anger and sadness, which in my head are two ends of the same spectrum, at either extreme end of it. And then really looking at how it can affect relationships, as you sort of mentioned a little earlier, because of the trust issues, the avoidance, getting stuck in those unhealthy dynamics, especially with the CPTSD, those dynamics we've seen that traumatized us, unconsciously repeating those patterns and dynamics and ending up back in the same space, which is why we can be unintentionally bringing that stuff into our life, which is just going to aggravate and continue our difficulties and our unhealthy responses to everything. Any and everything that we find triggering. I really want to take a second to really get into the fact that this can affect, yes, how our brain pathways work, but also like how we look at ourselves and how we look at the world in general. If we went through something that made us feel unsafe, then we are likely to look at the world and look at it as a scary and unsafe place. Or if we look at what happened to us and it was something that was telling us we were bad or we were wrong or we deserved what happened to us, then we might start to believe those things about ourselves. and
Well,
really internalize those sorts of reactions to it.
to exactly your point where I was mentioning with my current partner versus an ex, where it's like I couldn't trust myself. I was like, I thought I was safe before. And so now I'm like, well, I feel safe now, but I thought I was safe before. And so then I legitimately did not trust myself. And so it's like, I absolutely understand what you're saying. And I think another thing to kind of note as well is it's like, just because, let's just say a trauma happened with a romantic relationship, doesn't necessarily mean, oh, my responses are only going to be with romantic relationships going forward. It could be, even with friendship relationships or even familial or anything like that. It can be triggered in ways that you never imagined. I'm like, this makes no sense. Like, why am I upset over this? And there has to be like an internal kind of review. And I am still obsessed and still thinking about how you referred to programming because our brains are computers. And like, girl, get a system update. I am going to take that and I'm going to spread that to so many people like in my life. I'm just like, our brains are computers. I love that so much.
Good. I'm glad that you are walking away with something that helps. And I feel like that's like my biggest thing in life. I'm not good at science. I'm not good at technicalities. So don't ask me about all of the different parts of the brain and their names and all of the chemicals that are technically in there and stuff. I can look it up and get a refresher and remember, but I don't just know that stuff off the top of my head. I live and work in a place where metaphors are like my bread and butter. That's the way that I understand all of this stuff. And it's the way that I've learned to help other people understand these things is by giving it something outside of the brain to help you conceptualize it. And so even if you are the only person who walks away from this conversation who's like, I'm taking that computer thing, like this episode is already a success for me just because you're like, that helps to change the way you think about it. And now that's going to be something you can use to help challenge yourself going forward. It makes me warm and fuzzy. I love it.
Yeah, and I mean, I wasn't meant to compliment you, like, but I'm glad. It was just one of those things where I'm like, that's amazing. I didn't need you to get a big head about it. I was just like, I've never thought or heard of it like that. And I'm like, hell yeah. And I fucking hate system updates on my phone. And to some degree, system updates as a person will suck too
Well,
sometimes.
yeah, but imagine if you hadn't had a system update on your phone in 20 years.
Right. It's just mind blowing,
It's like
It's
people who
just,
still use flip phones.
I mean, with the analogies that you've given, that has been super helpful. I work very well with analogies, so thank you.
And so if we sort of have to discuss like what it is, what can it look like, and of course want to keep it open for people to ask further questions about those symptoms, because of course we didn't have time to touch on every single one. And again, some of those nuances and how a reaction might look different between each of those sections. But I want to make sure we have some time to talk about like, what do we do with this? How do we handle it after we realize, okay, I'm traumatized or something traumatic has happened to me? That's great and all, but what do we do with that information? How do we move forward from that place? And how do we find a way to heal ourselves? And I think there's sort of two parts of it. There's the internal process and there's sort of the external process. So when I think of the internal process, first is acknowledging what happened, really saying, this is a thing that happened to me. And that can be hard for people, especially if the way their trauma has come out with them compartmentalizing or maybe not even remembering because they dissociated during it, doing whatever happened. And so the first thing is we have to get back in contact with that part of ourselves and we have to acknowledge that this thing happened. Even if we can't pinpoint each little thing or like every detail of that moment, just being able to say, I went through this traumatic experience. I don't remember all of what happened between the time it started and the time that ended, but I can say this was definitely traumatic.
Just really quickly, so it's
Yes.
like acknowledging that it happened, but also like kind of giving the weight that it deserves to some degree, whether or not you necessarily know what it is. But it's
Mhm.
like we've somewhat talked about it, and I don't necessarily want to go too in the weeds about it, but our parents and the original initial children went through some pretty traumatic stuff. And it's a lot of like, yeah, it was traumatic, but whatever. And it's like, oh no, no, not but the whatever. Like clearly things have impacted you since then. And giving it that but whatever is diminishing how how it's impacted you is diminishing what actually happened. Even if you don't fully understand the weight of it, just not dismissing it.
Well, and that's that compartmentalization. I sort of think of it as, get ready for another metaphor, everyone. You know, those comedically full lockers in like 90s high school shows where they like open the locker and then there's just like a flood of stuff comes pouring out of it because it was so ridiculously full. I think a lot of times we do that with our trauma, right? We have a closet or a locker someplace where we shove it all in, and that works, sort of. But then that also means we can never get in there. And it doesn't mean there's not still a bologna sandwich in there rotting just because we didn't open the locker. It's still in there. And the smell is eventually going to escape and bother us. So trauma, we are very good at saying, I'm going to put this away in this place that is separate from me. I'm going to compartmentalize it. I'm going to put it away, which helps us to survive in the moment. But in the long run is not healthy because eventually the locker will explode and fill the hallway with whatever sort of ridiculous thing we've seen before in cartoons and stuff.
But to your point with the bologna sandwich, if that shit's rotting in there, even if you don't notice it because you're gotten used to the smell as it's rotting, other people walking by are going to be like, what the fuck is that? And it's like, same with our reactions. We might have reactions to shit that we don't realize we're reacting a certain way to that isn't normal or whatever, that people are going to pick up on. And it's like, are you okay? And I'm like, yeah, I'm fucking fine, because that's how I always react to this. Doesn't mean that it's actually fine. And I hate using fine and normal and this, that, and the other, but that's kind of where I'm trying to go, is it's like what's expected or what's normal.
It's hard not to use those words because it's part of our language. And especially thinking of, we grew up in the last century. We grew up in a different time where those things didn't maybe have the nuance and differences that they have now, or we didn't recognize the stigma that came with those things. And it's just also a natural human reaction to say, I'm fine, to have that knee-jerk reaction of, I'm fine, and to not really go beyond that surface level, especially when we're talking to people or somebody says, hey, how you doing? So validating your feelings for sure is a huge part of it, right? Acknowledging what happened, validating your feelings, even the negative ones, even being angry, even being frustrated, sad, disgusted, like all of those feelings are valid. They're yours and they are valid. But we also have to know the situation wasn't our fault, and our reaction in and of itself isn't necessarily our fault either, especially if we don't know what we're doing, as you just sort of mentioned. If we don't know that we're responding in a different way or that we're having these sort of reactions because it is so sort of normalized in our brains and so typical of what we might get into. And it's also hard because there's a part of us that has to recognize we may never receive quote unquote justice for what happened to us. We may not ever be able to fully resolve the situation. There may not be a resolution in the way that we want, especially when we're looking at other people. If someone treated you in a certain way, they may not get their comeuppance. They might go on to have a beautiful life. And you can sit and be like, that's unfair that they got to have that beautiful life. And now I'm going to be miserable because of that. Well, then they're still winning, right? Like that's still you losing out more than anything. So we have to make peace in some ways with the fact that there might not be a tidy little bow to tie this up with at the end of whatever this process is, whatever our internal process is. What's more important is not that there's a nice, neat bow, but is that we get to a place where we can put all of that weight down. Like you said earlier, that weight feeling like it was lifted off your shoulders as you processed your trauma and processed everything that was happening. That's where we need to put our focus. I can't control what someone else does, and I can't control how karma gets them, but I can control if I'm going to let their karma keep affecting me. If I'm going to keep that bitterness, not to say we're excusing their behavior or being like, oh no, we can totally be cool with them now, especially if it's like a person directly doing something awful to you. No, but recognizing that there might not be something where we can walk away feeling like that was justice. Life's not a movie. There is not a perfect tie-up at the end of this story. And so that can be a hard piece too to sort of sit with and be able to accept when trying to process.
Yeah. It's definitely one of those things where it's a lot, and this is where I found therapy to be very helpful, where it's like a lot of my internal stuff is just self-acceptance in those
Mm,
moments that I could not control. And whether it was my immediate reactions or how I've been triggered since and how to work through those triggers, there's a lot of unknowns in the world. And so when you have
mm,
something where in the moment you didn't realize X, Y, and Z was happening, or you later realize it, and it's like, okay, well, how do I move on? And so it's a lot of self check ins. Maybe you don't need a system update, but you just need to check in on your system. Are there any viruses? Is there any malware? Like that's, again, I just love it so much. Those self reflections have helped me so much. And again, therapy has been very good as almost like a guided meditation of self reflection, where it's just like, all right, let's do these check ins. Let's see where we're at and let's see what caused this. And sometimes I can do that on my own. And then sometimes I do need my therapist of like, I don't know what the fuck, why I responded this way. This makes no sense to me. And then she's like, okay, well, maybe it's related to this or that. And I'm like, I never even put those two pieces together. And so it's been nice to have those moments as well, especially with trauma. It can be hard. And from my own experience, it can be hard to not have justice or, the neat little bow. But I think that putting yourself first and kind of understanding yourself can be a little bow in and of itself.
And, we keep bringing up therapy, which is one of those external processes that we can do to help
Yeah.
ourselves cope and process. And I think it's important to remember there are lots of different kinds of therapy that you can do out there, especially when it comes to trauma. There's more narrative style trauma focused treatment. There's like rapid eye movement stuff they do, which there's EMDR. There's just general CBT sort of talk therapy stuff. Like there's so many different options, and they don't all have to look like so it's a Freudian thing and you lay on the couch and tell me what is your problem about your mother. First of all, talk therapy doesn't really look like that anymore as
Thank
far as I
God.
know. Generally, knock wood, there's no one out there still quite on that. I guess who am I to judge if it works for them? But the point is there's just such an array of different angles that you can come out with a therapist, with someone who is trained to guide you and help you go through it. And that's the important thing to remember too. This is your journey. The therapist is just there to help you see into those corners, to understand those things, to give, as you sort of said, the guided reflection process. You reflect, they are just there to help guide. So I also want to encourage people to, if therapy didn't work for you once, don't get stuck in your head that therapy can never work. Maybe it just wasn't a good relationship. Maybe it just wasn't the best style for you. Maybe there's an alternative. And I think any therapist should be happy to help you find an alternative if it's not working for you. I can't speak for all of the therapists in the world, but also remembering even without therapy or in addition to therapy, there's other people we can talk to as well. That can be, again, like group therapy or something like that, but it can just be the people you love, like with your support group, with people in your community, if that has happened, right? Finding local support groups. So like say it was something to do with your queer identity. I live near Chicago and there's the Center on Halsted, which is like a queer hub, and they have all kinds of different resources you can get through them. You can do group therapy there. They have support groups. They have all different things that can lead to even more. So finding the community of people who maybe have gone through similar things. I will lay down the caveat of there is a difference between talking with people and dumping on people. So we have to recognize what that person is able to take from us. And there are some things that are going to be really hard for you to just tell your friend about, not just because of you, but because maybe what traumas they've gone through in the past. Like maybe they're not in a space where they can hear about your assault because it triggers them to their own, right? Or, we talk a lot about the family stuff. Yes, we should talk about this with our family, and that is important, but we have to do the work outside to be able to have these helpful conversations with our family where we already understand and can conceptualize what we're talking about. So please, yes, look to the people around you for love and support, but realizing that there's a limit to sometimes what someone who's not a professional can do. Professionals are trained to take on all of that super duper heavy, intense stuff. Hear the details of what happened during that mass shooting. Hear the details of what happened when you were abused, and be able to carry it without it necessarily traumatizing them. But someone that we're close to, it can activate them. It can be traumatic to them as well. So finding support that is also sort of appropriate for your need. So again, considering, acknowledging what has happened, considering what your need is, and then searching for the right supports to build a support system around you that includes family, that includes friends, that includes community, that includes therapy, all of those things. It can't just be from one place. I hope now that we've sort of done this episode, and I hope with all episodes, that people who are listening, watching, that they will comment with their opinions, comment about things maybe they feel like maybe we missed. Because again, this is a very small amount of time to talk about a very big subject. So I hope that people hit the like button, subscribe, but please comment down there where you can comment. Please do, because we want everyone out there to be part of this conversation, not just Jack and I, but we want this conversation to lead to more and more conversations in this space and outside of it, because life is hard, but talking about mental health shouldn't be.